This is a video about what I've learned about the Series 2 L400 automatic transmissions. Obviously, do your own research and only do repairs that you're comfortable with. My experience is restricted to 5 Delicas from 1999 through 2002, but this should apply to pretty much all the Series 2 Delicas from 1997 through 2007. I'm going to be going over what we've learned from operating Delicas and basic maintenance, and then finally, not so basic maintenance. This transmission is shifted by a computer that lives just underneath the glove box on these vans. And this uses an early form of artificial intelligence that varies its shifting based on what it's learned from your driving. An interesting consequence of this is that sometimes it can learn wrong. And we were just down in Mexico and we had transmission misbehaving a little bit and lugging the engine down on steep hills. So I disconnected the battery for 10 minutes and hooked it back in, and the computer got it right the second time. On the Series 2, the shifting is done by the same module that runs the computer with the fuel injection and ignition. What this means is that the computer that's running the transmission also has access to all the engine sensors, and it uses this to adjust shift timing. So the interesting consequence of this is that a bad engine sensor can make you think that your transmission is bad. And this is in fact why I swapped out this transmission, is because the mass airflow sensor on the engine was bad enough to confuse the transmission controller. With the Series 2 Delicas, Mitsubishi switched from a Toyota transmission to a Nissan-made Jatco transmission. And while this is a fine transmission for van application, it's not tough enough for off-roading. And just putting it in low range on the transmission doesn't actually help you, because what blows up is the final planetary gear set at the back of the transmission. If you really get into hard off-roading and bouncing around and slipping wheels. But you can decrease the stress on the transmission by 2/3 by putting your transfer case into 4-low. The correct procedure for measuring the oil, the amount of oil in an automatic transmission, is to dip it while the engine is running. And this means that the oil will be circulating throughout the entire system. Everything will be full of oil. And then at that point, you can get an accurate reading. Ideally, this should be done when transmission's hot, but normally there's an indicator for the level you expect when it's hot and when it's cold. Our first van, I didn't know this. And if you dip it when everything is turned off, then the oil will slowly fill back in and you'll get a high reading, which causes you to underfill it. And then the transmission will slip on you. This is not a modern transmission, so don't use modern transmission oil. Newer automatic transmission fluids are normally synthetics, and they're made to be very slippery for perhaps improving fuel economy. But this transmission expects an older, stickier oil. And I've been using Dexron 3 so far. It's cheap, and I have no complaints with it, and any problems we've had have been nothing to do with the oil. Changing the oil in an automatic transmission is a thoroughly unsatisfying, messy business. Typically, the procedure is to use the transmission while idling the engine to pump oil out through the oil cooler. And you break it up front by the lines up by the radiator and pump it out in a bucket. I'll link in a decent video that shows how to do this. You may also want to just find a shop who will do some kind of a flush. I don't think it's terribly tricky. There's probably better ways of doing this. Here we see the oil pan on the bottom of the transmission. Replacing the oil filter or any access into the bottom of the transmission requires removing the exhaust pipe from the left side of the engine, which is routed underneath the oil pan. Mitsubishi's recommended way of doing this is with a great big long 1/2-inch impact, get up to the back of the exhaust manifold that we can't even see here. It's so far up in there.
and remove two 19mm bolts. And then this pipe will come out. There used to be a way of breaking the pipe in half right here, just a joint. And this has to be done on both sides of the engine. And what scares me about this is that if those bolts sheared on the back of the engine and the exhaust manifold, you'd have to take the exhaust manifold off to replace them, which would be a hard job, may even require dropping the engine out of the vehicle. So on this vehicle, on the wife's van here, I cut off this section of exhaust and just put this patch on, which just doesn't look great, but it does work. On this van that's being worked on, there was enough welding that needed to be done on the exhaust system anyway, that I did decide to just go ahead and pull the entire exhaust system off, which made access to the oil pan on the transmission pretty straightforward. You can see that it's not really a big deal to unbolt this from the side of the transmission here. There's one bolt here, and then there's two big bolts that bolt this up to the exhaust manifold. So as long as these 19mm nuts right here come off and the bolts that are captive to the exhaust manifold don't shear, then really this is pretty straightforward if you've got a great big impact. Access to the transmission, particularly on top, can be improved by removing a frame cross member that runs across right between the transmission and transfer case. And then you can drop the transmission down 2 or 3 inches, which makes it quite a bit nicer to get on top, especially for connectors and if you have to get on top of the transfer case. If you have decided to do an oil filter service and drop the pan off, you should know about a change that Mitsubishi made in somewhere around 2001. This is the old style oil pan, which you see is nice and flat on the bottom. And this is the new oil pan, which is quite a bit more intricate looking. It seems like they've increased the oil capacity a little bit. And what goes along with this is in fact a different oil filter. So this is the older generation oil filter, 2001 and before. And you can see that it's pretty flat on the bottom. And this new oil pan, they specify it to use this oil filter that has this neck built out of the bottom of it. And I'll put links to those part numbers. An annoying thing about taking off the oil pan is that the Japanese technicians, they really like to use their silicone to seal this on. And I'm not opposed to silicone, but this transmission will just drip oil forever, which makes it hard to get a freshly siliconed pan on without getting oil onto your sealing surface. So I'm a big fan of just good old-fashioned gaskets. You can get these nice thick cork gaskets that seal perfectly. Unfortunately, some of these gaskets don't actually fit the oil pan, so I'm not sure what they're for. So just be aware of that, and I will call them out in the part number list for the oil filters. Putting on and removing the oil pan, the sticking point is usually this dipstick neck, which plugs up into the extension tube that's bolted to the engine. Just be aware of this, and obviously remove your dipstick before starting this so you don't mangle it when you're pulling this down. Walking around the transmission on the floor here, we have oil cooler lines that go attached to pipes that go up to the front through your radiator and a oil cooler up there. With the oil cooler, keep in mind that if you're replacing a transmission which is blown up, the oil cooler can also collect chunks of metal. So you can swap the transmission, and then the particles come back from the oil cooler and promptly blow up your replacement transmission. We have an output sensor right here, which is used by the transmission computer to figure out how fast the output of the transmission is running. Torque converter on the front of the transmission. There are 6 bolts that go in here that attach the front of the torque converter. into the flywheel of the engine. Easy enough to take apart. Just a couple things to keep in mind. If you are reassembling this, it's actually quite tricky to get the torque converter fully seated back in the transmission. And if you don't do that, then when you bolt it to the engine, it's going to crush the front of the transmission in between because you won't have clearance. Just be aware of that. And it's actually fairly straightforward to measure how that it's seated back in far enough by just putting a straight edge across the front of the engine and measuring back to these captive nuts on the torque converter. Torque converter on this transmission actually has a lockup clutch inside. So that can be used by the transmission as a final gear past drive and overdrive, which will bypass the fluid coupling nature of the torque converter and lock it up solid so you get the fuel economy benefits of a manual transmission. If you're removing the transmission, make sure that you pop this little stub shaft out of the flywheel before you start to move the transmission out and down. And if you don't, then the torque converter will jam up terribly and you'll have a bad day. On the left-hand side of the transmission, we have the input speed sensor right here, which is also used by the ECU to check the gear ratio that's being accomplished. Between the crankshaft sensor and the input sensor into the transmission and the output sensor from the transmission, ECU has a pretty good idea if there's anything going wrong in the transmission. We have some test ports, which can be used to check pressure at various points in the transmission. But if you don't have a fancy hose to plumb a pressure gauge into that, that's probably not terribly useful. Your column shifter on your steering wheel is used to shift a valve deep in the transmission right here. And then in addition to that valve, we also have a system of switches integrated right here, which is used to tell the ECU and the indicator lights on the dash what gear you've actually put the transmission in. Finally, and most interestingly, we have the solenoid wires that go into the valve body on the bottom of the transmission. And these come into this connector right here. And that's actually how the computer shifts the transmission. Interestingly, if none of the solenoids are engaged, then your steering wheel shifter is still able to put the transmission into a mechanical limp mode, which will give you drive, third gear, reverse, neutral, and park. So if the computer decides that it doesn't have control of the transmission, decides to go into limp mode, or if you unplug this connector right here and your transmission is mechanically sound, then this can be used, this feature of a mechanical only mode can be used to get you out. This particular transmission is a V4A51 part number. The V means that it's four-wheel drive. So we'll have this housing on the back to bolt onto a transfer case to give you four-wheel drive. And 4 means there's 4 speeds. Some Pajeros and Monteros were equipped with the V5A51, which has 5 speeds. And there's also R4A51s, which were put onto some SUVs, Pajero Monteros, which is a rear-wheel drive only option. So instead of having this little stub shaft here, there will be a place to poke your drive shaft into your back axle. Since this transmission was put into Monteros, this means that we can get parts for it in North America if we just shop around for the Montero and Montero Sport on websites like Rock Auto. Final opinions, judgment calls. This is a good transmission. It will last if you don't imitate Russian YouTube videos. The Delica is not a rock crawler, it's just a good four-wheel drive high clearance minivan. I've replaced oil filters on 4 Delicas, and the internals of every transmission looked amazing. It probably didn't even make sense to replace the filter. I just wanted peace of mind. And finally, I would never try to repair one of these. There's lots of scrap Delicas with perfectly good transmissions. A mechanically minded person with a transmission jack can swap this out in a day or two.